Welcome, everybody, to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension, Wisconsin 4-H. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, PBS Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night by Zoom, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Adam Bechle. He's an engineer with the University of Wisconsin Sea Grant Institute. And now I'm going to ask him the 5 questions that I ask everybody. He doesn't know these 5 questions, but I bet he'll get them. Adam, where were you born?
Green Bay, Wisconsin.
Oh. And where'd you go to high school?
Preble High School in Green Bay, Wisconsin.
And then where'd you go for your undergrad and what did you study?
I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to study civil and environmental engineering.
And then where'd you go for your PhD and what was it in?
Same answer. I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, civil and environmental engineering with a focus on water resources.
And so that you did this kind of work as part of your PhD, is that correct?
Yep, related work, yep.
Very good. And then when did you join the Sea Grants?
Well, I first started working with Sea Grant in 2016 as a postgraduate fellow, and then joined on as a full-time staff in 2019, June of 2019.
So my friend Todd Brybe suggested you as a speaker. I'm very grateful to Todd for suggesting you. I'm delighted that you were willing to be here. I think Titus Seilheimer is on and watching. We just got to go up to Manitowoc last Tuesday and Wednesday so that he could record a Wednesday night at the lab. This is a great week for me and Lake Michigan. You get to talk about both Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. It's going to be fun to hear about adapting to changing Great Lakes coasts. Go ahead, Adam. You can start whenever you'd like.
Great. Well, thanks for having me tonight. It's a pleasure to speak at Wednesday night at the lab. Again, my name's Adam Bechle. I'm Coastal Engineering Outreach Specialist with Wisconsin Sea Grant. For those of you who aren't familiar with Wisconsin Sea Grant, we are headquartered on the UW-Madison campus, but we have satellite offices throughout the state in Superior, Manitowoc, Green Bay, Milwaukee. We provide research, education, and outreach on the sustainable use of our Great Lakes. And here in Wisconsin, we're fortunate to have 2 really great lakes, Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about adapting to a changing Great Lakes coast. I'm sure many of you have heard in the news throughout the years about either record high Great Lakes water levels or going back a few years, record low Great Lakes water levels. And those sort of extremes really can cause a lot of trouble along our Great Lakes coast, not only in Wisconsin, but across the Great Lakes. I put up a couple pictures here on the bottom of bluff erosion near the Summers or Kenosha area, coastal flooding in Green Bay, and on the right-hand side, what happens when we have low water levels. And one thing that can be problematic is we don't have enough water to get our boats in and out of our harbors and marinas. So these pictures come from Wisconsin. As I mentioned, the first one in Summers down here in blue, Green Bay in purple, and then up in the Lake Superior area in red. So taking a step back at the Great Lakes, I know for me, it took me a little bit when I started working on the Great Lakes to remember back to elementary school which lake was which. So you can give yourself a little bit of a quiz now and try and remember. If you remember, the mnemonic device HOMES gets you what the names of the Great Lakes are, but which one is which? We have Lake Huron here, kind of in the middle. Lake Ontario, that's all the way to the east. Then we have Lake Michigan, which Wisconsin has. Lake Erie, and then Lake Superior. Those are our 5 Great Lakes. So what I'm going to do now is flip the Great Lakes on their side and get a view of the Great Lakes as a hydraulic system, how water flows through our Great Lakes. So up at the top of the system is Lake Superior here, about a little over 600 feet above sea level. Lake Superior flows out through the St. Mary's River into Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. Lake Michigan Huron is considered one lake from a water level perspective because they're connected through the Straits of Mackinac, which allows the water level to be pretty much the same between those two lakes. Lake Michigan Huron flows out the St. Clair River through Lake St. Clair, this little one down here, through the Detroit River and into Lake Erie. And then Lake Erie flows out through the Niagara River, over Niagara Falls, drops over 300 feet into Lake Ontario, which is our lower Great Lake. Even then, Lake Ontario is 243 feet above sea level, and then flows out through the St. Lawrence River and St. Lawrence Seaway through a series of locks and dams out into the Atlantic Ocean and out to the sea. So you can see this Great Lakes, each lake we refer to kind of, Lake Superior, Lake Michigan, Huron, but they are a connected system that flows through connecting channels and out to the ocean. So the story of the last few years has been record high water levels. So this up here is showing water levels for the whole period of record that we have going back to 1918. So it's probably a little bit hard to see, but that's not the point. The point is to just kind of notice the trends, and we see all the lakes kind of fluctuate and go up and go down. And then if I draw your attention to the far right, you'll see all the Great Lakes were at record highs. Lake Erie and Lake Ontario set all-time record highs. Lake Superior and Lake Michigan Huron set monthly records, and were 1 inch and 2 inches respectively away from setting all-time record highs last year. Since then, things have cooled off a little bit. The lake levels have gone a little bit down, but that's going to be one of the things I really get into today in adapting to a changing Great Lakes coast is what is going on with Great Lakes water levels. How is that making the coast change? And then what sort of strategies can be used to adapt to these challenges? So first off, when we talk about Great Lakes water levels, I like to kind of clarify what is a water level or a lake level in the Great Lakes. And so here we have two pictures. Looks like the water level is drastically different between these two pictures, but when we're talking about lake levels, you may think I'm crazy, but it's the same in these two pictures. And you'll ask, Adam, how are those two pictures have the same water level? Well, usually when we talk about lake levels, we talk about the water level averaged over a daily, monthly, or annual period. And when you hear Great Lakes water levels in the news, typically it's talking about a monthly average. So these pictures were just taken a few minutes apart. Definitely the lake has changed in level, but when we talk about the monthly lake level, it's the same in these two pictures. There are different timescales of how water levels change on the Great Lakes, and first is the big one. That's what we saw kind of in the initial graph I showed, interannual, so between years. Again, this is 100 years of Lake Michigan water levels, and we see them go up and down, periods of high and periods of low, changing in between the years. Within that signal is a seasonal signal. So that little heartbeat pattern is actually a seasonal signal in water levels. On average, they're the lowest in the middle of winter, lowest in February for Lake Michigan, and highest in the summer. In Lake Michigan, they on average are peak in July. And that's because of the water cycle. So most of our precipitation falls as snow or stays on the landscape in the winter and is not entering the lakes, except for that falls directly on the lake. And then we get runoff in the spring, and precipitation is naturally greatest in the spring and summer. That causes our lakes to rise throughout the spring and summer. And then as precipitation decreases and actually evaporation of water from the water surface increases throughout the fall and winter, causing that water level to drop. And then on the bottom, we see here is our short-term water level fluctuations. That's really what we saw on the previous slide when we had that water rush up and inundate the dock. These are kind of on the order of seconds. So those would be like wind waves. If you were out to look at Lake Mendota or any lake nearby and you see the choppy surface, those are wind waves. Those water levels are varying on the order of seconds. And then minutes to hours is when we have a storm surge. So we have a storm, strong winds blowing, pushing the water and changing the water level locally, just temporarily though. So those are kind of timescales of water level changes. When we talk about Great Lakes water levels, we're really thinking about the first two, the interannual and the seasonal changes. So come back again to what Lake Michigan and Huron water levels look like. So this again is our 100 years of water level data. And we see, as I said, highs and lows. That seasonal fluctuation on average is about a year, or excuse me, about a foot within a year. So between the low in the winter and the high in the summer, about a foot. And we see record high water levels was set in October of 1986. We had a record low water level on Lake Michigan in January of 2013. And the difference between those is about 6.5 feet, just under 6.5 feet between the extreme high and the extreme low. We've seen rapid changes throughout history. So this in the 1950s, lake levels increased 3.3 feet in a year and a half, and a pretty rapid rise. We've seen rapid decreases. So in the 80s, a decrease of 4.3 feet in just about 2.5 years. We've also seen periods of prolonged highs, highlighted it here in the 70s, but we saw those in the 80s. We're seeing a period of prolonged highs now. And we just came out of a period of prolonged 15-year low water levels earlier in the 2000s. So we see the story of water levels is they never really stay the same, and we need to expect highs and lows. So what makes water levels go up and down in the Great Lakes? Well, we need to think back to kind of a water budget. What water's coming in, what water's going out, and how imbalances can drive waters to go up or down. So first part of our water level budget, as I alluded to, was precipitation falling directly onto the lake surface. We also have precipitation falling onto the land around the lakes and the watersheds, and that runs off and goes into the lake. We also have water that leaves the lake through evaporation from the lake surface. This is usually highest when we have dry air, we have high wind speeds, and we have a warm lake temperature and a cool air surface. Typically, we see that in the fall and winter. That really drives water off the lake and into the air. Those three components, when we talk about water levels, is known as the net basin supply of water entering and leaving that lake. So precipitation plus runoff, those add water, and then evaporation takes it out. So when those three are kind of imbalanced, if we have more water going in than out, we typically see the lakes go up. And when we have more water leaving than entering, we see the lakes go down. Now, as I mentioned early on, we also have the lakes being connected by these connecting channels. Those also can add water or take water out. We also have diversions into and out of the lake system. One notable one for Lake Michigan is the Chicago River diversion. And now it's time for a little bit of water level influence trivia. So the Chicago River used to flow into Lake Michigan, but at the turn of the 20th century was reversed to flow out of Lake Michigan, carry the water away from Chicago, and thereby carrying sewage away from Chicago into the Mississippi River Basin. So how much does that water level diversion affect Lake Michigan Huron water levels? Maybe ponder that for a moment. And you'll be interested to know that this discharge is actually dictated by Supreme Court decree at 3,200 cubic feet per second of water flowing out of Lake Michigan. So averaged over the course of a year, that's 750 billion gallons of water. But averaged, if you take that over the 45,000 square miles of Lake Michigan Huron, that's about 0.8 inches per year of water coming out of Lake Michigan Huron. Now, since the diversion was put in over 100 years ago, it's estimated that that's led to about a 4-inch decrease in the Lake Michigan water level over that 100 years. So when we think of what really changes water levels, nature really controls feet. The amount of precipitation and evaporation we get dictate the feet, and our human influences are on the scale of inches. So why have we had such high water levels recently? Well, part of the story there, a big piece of the story is we've had a very wet recent few years. This is a graph of precipitation in the upper Midwest climate region over 1920 to 2020. On the y-axis, you see inches of precipitation, and that black line in the middle is the long-term average. And since 2012, every year has been above average precipitation. Maybe this year we won't get there, but we've had a very wet few years recently. So we broke the all-time record in 2017 and broke it again in 2019. The period from 2015 to 2020 was the wettest 5-year period on record. So when we talk about imbalances in that water budget driving lake levels, this is a huge imbalance, a lot of water entering the system. So breaking it down kind of year by year, why are water levels so high now? Well, starting in January of 2013, we hit that record low water level. Then right away, we had high runoff and high precipitation year in 2013. We had a low evaporation winter. That was our first polar vortex, and we didn't really see much seasonal decline in water levels. Then we had another high runoff, high precipitation year, and started getting high inflow from Lake Superior because the water level in Lake Superior had gone up. Another low evaporation winter that brought water levels to about average within a period of 2 years. Then things cooled off a little bit. We didn't see water levels drive up too much through 2015 and 2016. And then 2017, as I mentioned, broke a record for precipitation, high runoff and high precipitation year, cooled off for 2018, and then bam, another record precipitation year in 2019. Really just water upon water stacking up year after year, leading us to 2019 and 2020, a winter of 2019 being a low evaporation year, setting the stage for records to be broken in Lake Michigan Huron. So monthly records were broken from January to January to July. We got about 2 inches away from that all-time record high in July of 2020. And since then, we've actually started going down. So the story now is we've had pretty low precipitation, and we're about almost 2 feet below where we were June a year ago, which is pretty remarkable. This has been described in a new, relatively new journal article from Drew Grunwald and his collaborators out of the University of Michigan, and called it a tug of war within the hydrologic cycle, talking about that tug of war between evaporation and precipitation, and just how much water we've gotten in the last few years, driving water levels up. So what's behind our recent drop in water levels? I kind of alluded to it, but we're in a drought. And so we've had a lot less water entering the Great Lakes in the last few months. Had about half of our normal precipitation in 2021. I think the month of June is going to up that a little bit. I don't know where everyone is, but Madison, we've been reasonably rainy the last week or so. But before that, we really were under hitting how much precipitation we normally have, which really contributed to that water level drop recently. We're still pretty high when it comes to what we consider average water level. So this is the Army Corps of Engineers water level forecast for the next 6 months. And so to orient you here, across the top is time. So this shows the last 2 years of water levels and then the next 6 months. And then on the y-axis, we have the water level, and on the left here is feet. So this dashed blue line is the long-term average water level. Again, we see that seasonal fluctuation, highest in the summer, lowest in the winter. The red line here is where we've been. This is the last 2 years of water levels. And those black lines with numbers above them, those are the monthly record highs. So like I said, going back to 2020, we started setting records in January of 2020, monthly records all the way to July. Oh, August was a record, I misspoke earlier. And then since then, we haven't broken any monthly records. We've actually gone down quite a bit to about 2 feet above where the long-term average. So looking out the next 6 months, look pretty favorable for sort of getting a little bit closer to average water levels. So the green line is the center of the forecast, and that red cone around it, think about hurricane forecast, sort of our cone of uncertainty, has Lake Michigan Huron sitting anywhere between 1 foot to 1.5 feet above average, which compared to where we were last year is sitting pretty good. A lot of folks are pretty happy about that. Again, still above average, but definitely not as bad as we had been the last 2 years. Lake Superior, similar story. I know I've talked a lot about Lake Michigan Huron, but Lake Superior started breaking records January of 2020 and has started to go down a little bit quicker than Lake Michigan Huron, and is quite close to being back to the long-term average right now, and projected to be pretty darn close to the long-term average for the next 6 months. Of course, if we get wet weather over the next 6 months, we could go higher in that forecast. But right now, things are looking pretty good. So one question is, what will climate change do to impact Great Lakes water levels? Well, we think back to our water budget and how will those components change? So we expect a wetter and warmer climate. So expecting increased precipitation onto the lake surface, increased runoff into the lake, but in a warmer climate also increased evaporation. And so we have higher inputs as well as that higher output. And so how are those going to play with each other? There isn't a clear indication whether the Great Lakes are going to trend upwards or downwards. So sort of the latest guidance is potentially higher highs, potentially lower lows. Those extremes might swing a little quicker and be a little bit greater because we have these more intensified inputs and outputs. So that's where I say not quite sure, but it's good to anticipate higher highs and lower lows going forward. So that's kind of a brief summary of what's going on with Great Lakes water levels. And now I'd like to get into, well, what are they doing? How are the coasts changing in response to the Great Lakes water levels being so high? So I alluded to this in my title slide, a couple different examples of what's going on in the Great Lakes. First, we'll start with coastal flooding in Green Bay. And so let's take a conceptual look at what causes coastal flooding. So we'll start with us being at average water levels. And so low-lying areas on the coast can be susceptible to coastal flooding. When a strong storm comes in with strong winds blowing up, that storm surge can pushing water up onto the coast, as well as having waves, and wave run-up can kind of crash up and bring more water up on the shoreline. At average water levels, in this example, the house has not experienced any issues, but at higher water levels, we have a running start. Basically, we're starting from a higher standpoint. That same storm pushes the same storm surge, and waves can lead to inundation of low-lying homes, and that's kind of exactly what's happened in the last few years. So Green Bay experienced coastal flooding in 2019 and 2020. And I want to dive into those events, particularly notable December 1st of 2019 and April 28th of 2020. But to kind of understand that, let's take a step back and look at the worst coastal flooding event in Green Bay history. April 8th, 1973. You see from the headline of the Green Bay Press Gazette, coastal flood forces 800 from their homes. The flood came in the middle of the night, bringing kind of icy waters into people's homes. Really, really bad situation in the city of Green Bay. You see the amount of inundation that happened there. So what happened here? Well, putting into the context of Great Lakes water levels, I've mapped up the water levels from 1960 to 2020 on Lake Michigan Huron. And looking back at the historic record, that was about a 3.3 foot storm surge on top of pretty high Great Lakes water levels, but not record high water levels. Bringing the water level of Lake Green Bay just above 584 feet above sea level. So we'll mark that 584 kind of as a benchmark for really bad flooding. Shortly after that flood, a dike was constructed along the bay to try to limit future flooding at that level. So we have to keep that in mind. We haven't had any flooding as serious as that since, and part of that is because the dike was constructed. Looking at the historic record for other notable flooding events, December 3rd of 1990, this was in terms of a storm hitting, a storm surge. This was the big one. A 5.4 foot storm surge struck Green Bay. This is the biggest on record by I think about 1.5 feet. The Army Corps of Engineers estimated this to be a 1 in 300 year chance storm. So the biggest storm surge recorded on record. But if you look at where the water levels were, fortunately, right about average, bringing that water level in Green Bay when you add the storm surge on top of the water levels, just about to that 584-foot mark. No reports of widespread devastating damage, partly because, again, that dike was constructed. But also lucky timing about not being at high water levels. Looking back at the top 5 storm surges in history recorded in Green Bay, none really occurred at really high water levels. So we didn't exceed that 584-foot mark. Then if we look at these 2 events I alluded to, December 1st, 2019, that was about a 2.4-foot storm surge. So when thinking about Green Bay, this is about an annual storm surge. This is about as large of a storm surge you can expect in Green Bay on a given year. It's about 2.4 feet when a strong storm comes blowing down the bay. And then in April 28th, we had another one, pretty similar magnitude, 2.6-foot storm surge. This was a little bit bigger, but again, not a super abnormal storm surge by any means, especially compared to that 5.4-foot storm surge. But when you stack those 2 storm surges on top of the record high or near record high water levels that they were at, that pushed the water level in Green Bay just about to that 584-foot mark and caused local flooding out along the bay. So these examples really underscore how much the high water levels can modulate coastal flooding out in Green Bay. Just comparing this big one, 5.4-foot storm surge, got to about the same level as these pretty regular storm surges that happened in 2019 and 2020. But because of where the water levels were, similar sort of flooding was experienced. So takes the big one to even cause concern at average water levels, and it takes a normal storm surge kind of at record high water levels. So covering coastal flooding, we'll move into coastal erosion. So how do water levels influence coastal erosion and sort of cause homes to start to fall over the edge of the bluff? Well, again, we'll sort of take our schematic look at it. So here we have a home up on top of a coastal bluff. A storm comes in, makes waves, and makes storm surge. Perhaps at average water levels, that storm can't really affect the bluff. But if we have high water levels, again, we're starting kind of at a higher starting point. We bring that same storm in. And in this case, perhaps the waves can start to get up above the beach and start to touch the toe of that bluff slope there. And as the waves kind of crash into the bluff slope, they take away material. They erode away at the toe of that bluff. And because if the water levels are high, those types of storms can reach the toe of the bluff more frequently and cause more and more erosion. And as more of that material is moved away, that slope loses its buttressing force that it had back when it was a nice continuous slope. That can destabilize the slope and cause it to collapse. In some cases, it may be the whole slope kind of failing at once. This is known as a deep-seated rotational slump, where the whole chunk of the bluff slope would collapse and slide out into the lake. Typically in Wisconsin, what more common failure mechanism is known as translational sliding. This is where a smaller section of the slope would fail, again, because it's been destabilized by that toe erosion. That chunk of the slope would kind of collapse and fall out onto the beach, leaving perhaps another destabilized section of the bluff where another failure could work its way up to the top. Compounding that is if water levels stay high, more waves could remove that material from the bottom and keeps making that slope steeper and steeper, destabilizing it and make it more prone to collapse. And that's typically what we see during these high water periods until that failure reaches the top of the bluff slope. And we get what is known as recession of the crest of the bluff, where the top of the bluff has finally kind of collapsed and has gotten closer to the home and starting to threaten the home. So Like I said, typically we see this failure sort of progress on its way up the bluff. And once we've started to remove that material and the slope is unstable, even if water levels went down, that failure cycle tends to work its way up the bluff. And there was a recent paper by Russ Kruger and Luke Zoot and Elmo Rawling out of UW-Madison Geosciences and the Wisconsin Geological and Natural History Survey that studied this at a few sites on Lake Michigan. And one of their conclusions, at least for the sites they studied, was unstable surfaces progressed up the bluff face at an average of 4.4 meters per year, roughly 15 feet per year. So thinking about that, for some of our tall bluffs in Wisconsin that are 100 plus feet, once you destabilize that toe, that failure works its way up over the course of almost a decade. And I'll illustrate that to you here with some pictures. So what's the impact of bluff height on coastal recession? So here in 1976, we see this home pretty close to the edge of the bluff. This is maybe about a 30 to 50 foot bluff. And we fast forward to 2012, we haven't seen a whole lot of change. That house looks about the same distance away. 2012 was roughly when we were about record low water levels. And as water levels started to rise by 2017, that bluff failure had worked its way all the way to the top of the bluff. The porch has fallen off the back. 2018, that failure continues to happen, and the home had to be removed by crane for safety reasons. Contrast that with a much taller bluff, about a 100-foot bluff in Milwaukee County. And to anchor where you're looking at, we have this old kind of coastal structure on the left here and another one on the right that can help orient you as I go through time, since there's not a structure on the top of the bluff. So again, 2012, about record low water levels. 2017, we've had a few years of rising water levels. Erosion has started to take away material from the bottom of the bluff, but the top of the bluff looks relatively intact. Vegetation's still there, trees are still there. Fast forward through time, 2018, we notice a little bit more of that sort of unvegetated area, and you can kind of notice these trees on the slope. 2019, we've lost a few of those trees, still haven't made its way all the way to the top, but then by 2020, we see that whole slope has lost its vegetation, it's become bare, and that failure has finally made its way to the top of the bluff. It took a lot longer on our taller bluffs for that failure to reach its way to the top. So that can be sort of problematic for our tall bluffs because the problem has already started, but may not be recognized at the top where our homes are and where real damage could be done. So I talked a lot about the influence of water levels and waves on coastal bluff recession, but there are other factors that go into it. So again, water levels and waves, that influences toe erosion, that can cause bluff slumping and sliding, those two failure mechanisms, but also as important as what's happening inside the bluff and on top of the bluff. If surface water collects and flows down the face of the bluff, can pick up speed as it flows downhill and kind of carve erosion channels and cause direct erosion of the soils. Also groundwater in the bluff can do two things. One thing, if it seeps out of the bluff face enough, it can cause erosion of the water flowing down the bluff face. But also the presence of water in that soil can weaken the strength of the soil and sort of cause instability and collapse. Typically, this was a recent study by Colin Rowland and Luke Zoot, Elmo Rawling, and Michael Cardiff, again from UW-Madison and the State Geologic and Natural History Survey, observed bluff failures over a period of time and noticed that these sort of collapses or failures really were tied to some sort of triggering mechanism, either a big rainfall event that again caused that groundwater seepage issue or flow down the bluff face, or a freeze thaw event where the soil gets sort of heaved apart when the water freezes, or a rapid melt event when the bluff face is initially frozen with ice, building up water behind that ice dam. And then when it melts, you lose the strength of the ice and a bluff failure results. So typically they noticed that there was some sort of kind of environmental triggering mechanism to these failures. So water levels and waves are not the only part of the story, but they are a major driver of bluff and shoreline erosion in the Great Lakes. Also, as humans, we make modifications to our bluff environments that maybe sometimes are not so great when we're thinking just specifically for bluff stability. We can modify drainage patterns. We build houses, we put driveways in, all sorts of surfaces that can concentrate surface water and contribute to those surface water issues and groundwater issues. If we cut down vegetation, we remove the benefits that it provides with its roots holding in the soil, and also the vegetation will extract water from the soil and sort of help mitigate some of those water problems. And also, as we look to protect our coasts, we may put rock down to armor it from wave erosion. That really changes how waves and water levels interact with our shorelines and can cause issues at areas adjacent to those shore structures that aren't protected. This was something that was studied by Chin Wu and his student Yin Ting, or I went to school with him. He went by Kevin then, in the College of Engineering at UW-Madison, studied changes in response to a large coastal structure, which caused rapid increase in erosion at neighboring properties, in part because it changed those nearshore dynamics and how the waves interacted with the bluffs. So a lot of things can go on to cause these sort of issues on our Great Lakes coast, but water level and waves are really a major driver. For those of you who may be interested in sort of exploring the coast and looking at how it's changed over the last few years, including some of the pictures I showed, the Wisconsin Shoreline Inventory and Oblique Photo Viewer is a great resource. If you just type that name into your favorite web search engine, it'll bring you to the viewer. You can look up historic photos from 1976, the mid 2000s up until 2020, and I think we had photos acquired earlier this year that will go up soon, as well as other layers like our measurements of bluff recession over time. And here in this example is showing for a period from 1956 to 2015. You can kind of check out and see how the coast has changed all around Wisconsin on this tool. It's really a great tool, and really anytime anyone asks me a question about a site in Wisconsin, I pull it up and go take a look at how things have changed throughout time. So that sort of covered how the coasts are changing in response to these water level fluctuations, as well as other stressors. So what strategies have been used to adapt to these changes? And first we'll start with something that I saw a lot of in the last few years, which is just response. People sort of putting whatever they can on their shoreline to try and stop erosion. Sometimes this can have detrimental effects. This is kind of busted concrete that was just pushed down the edge of the bluff. Not a whole lot of it made down to where the waves were impacting the bluff. And there could have been some damage done as that material tumbled down the slope. But this water level rise happened pretty fast and a lot of dramatic erosion happened. So it's certainly understandable sort of the desperation that was felt and to do anything possible to sort of save property. But when I'm talking to coastal property owners, I typically bring up this top-down approach to protect coastal investments. So starting at where the thing is that you care about, a home. And first starting at the top and saying, can that home be moved back away from the bluff, away from erosion, the erosion threat? What are some things that you can do to make sure water is being managed properly so that it's not contributing to erosion, and make sure that healthy vegetation is being maintained and certainly not being removed from the top of the bluff? And then working down our way the slope, again, some of those similar concepts, making sure that water is being managed, looking for any groundwater issues that might be causing erosion, and checking to make sure that there's good healthy vegetation. And then if those don't solve the problem and the home is still at threat, then start thinking about doing something to fight with Lake Michigan sort of try and slow down that toe erosion and try and reduce the impact of waves if necessary. So when it comes down to trying to slow down erosion, there's a sort of spectrum of shore protection options that are available. Traditionally, what has been done has been more of the hard infrastructure. So this spectrum goes from the left to this sort of softer, greener techniques over to our harder, grayer techniques. So traditionally, we've seen a lot of these harder, grayer techniques, most notably revetment, which is large armor stone placed on the shoreline to try and resist the forces of the waves. Bulkheads being vertical walls to try and do the same thing. Less so breakwaters trying to sort of reduce wave energy before it hits the shoreline. And then as we get to our softer techniques, trying to work with nature, building smaller gray structures to allow vegetation behind it, to some situations where the benefits of vegetation may be enough to help limit erosion. These softer green techniques typically don't work alone on our Great Lakes coast and our open coast environment because there's a lot of wave energy. So kind of a growing area of interest is trying to figure out where is a hybrid technique where we can still protect the shoreline, but try and keep it maybe as soft or as naturalized as possible. And that's an emerging area in the Great Lakes. There's a lot of thought being put into that right now. And hopefully we see a lot of great new projects going in the next few years that will kind of move us forward in that respect. From the municipal or county level, we've had a project with Wisconsin Sea Grant, working with the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program, the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, and the UW-Madison College of Engineering, working with the Lake Michigan communities and counties in Southeast Wisconsin, so Kenosha County, Racine County, Milwaukee County, and Ozaukee County, to try and enhance their capacity to be able to plan and prepare for these coastal hazards. And so what have we been doing? First thing we did was try and build up a contact base with these communities. This project started 4 years ago, kind of as water levels were rising, to try and help boost awareness of what these issues might be and get folks talking about these issues, both with people like myself who have a specialty in coastal engineering, as well as with each other, talking with peers who have to deal with similar issues. We looked at historic aerial photo to evaluate and map historic bluff recession to sort of give some information to help aid planning. That information is available on that Shoreline and Oblique inventory and photo viewer. We also created guidance on risk reduction practices that can be shared both with at the municipal level as well as with the residents, because often these staff are sort of the first line of people to get calls from residents who are concerned about erosion. So this is one example of a fact sheet we put together of when your home is at imminent risk from bluff failure, talking about the different options I went over and have contacts of who they can contact for assistance. And then working with the communities to go through and identify opportunities where they can build resilience to fluctuating Great Lakes water levels and other coastal hazards. And so as an example of what we've done with that, we put together what we call the coastal resilience self-assessment to go through all the phases basically that a local government can do to impact their ability to deal with and withstand coastal hazards. Just some quick examples from Milwaukee County Parks. They went through the self-assessment, and one of the questions was, are there estimates of the financial losses that may result from coastal hazards? Do you have a plan that makes recommendations to reduce coastal hazard vulnerability? They kind of answered no to these, but we're interested in capitalizing on this. So what they did was condition assessment for all their coastal parks and structures, and coming up with a strategy for how they'll manage their coastal assets going forward. The city of Racine worked with us and said, do you have updated maps of coastal hazard risks? And they said no. So what they've done is work with the data that we put together along with their local parcel data to kind of map out which properties in the city as well as surrounding areas might be susceptible to erosion, and then did outreach to those priority properties. And then our ordinances pertaining to coastal hazards consistent with surrounding jurisdictions. Do they have good ordinances in place that will help limit the risk of new development to coastal hazards, making sure new buildings are set back from the coast? They weren't sure, so they did an audit of their coastal ordinances to kind of figure out where there might be opportunities to strengthen those going forward. More about this project can be seen at the project website, sewicoastalresilience.org. We have blog posts and information about our work with coastal communities, as well as more information about coastal hazards on Wisconsin's Great Lakes. For those of you interested in kind of learning about options to adapt to a changing coast, we have 2 guides under that name, options and resources for coastal property owners, as well as options and resources for local government officials. Again, if you search adapting to a changing coast in your favorite web search engine, that should take you to both of these guides, and they're very, very nice visual, glossy guides to kind of get an understanding of what the different options are out there. So that'll do it from me. I just wanted to give that high level overview of what's been going on in the Great Lakes, how it's been affecting our coast, and what folks are doing about it. Again, my name's Adam Bechle. I'm the Coastal Engineering Outreach Specialist with Wisconsin Sea Grant. There's my email. I'd like to acknowledge a number of partners that I work with on this effort. I definitely don't do this work alone, and work with a lot of great state, regional, federal, and local partners to help build resilience to these changes on our Great Lakes coasts.
Thank you, Adam. And then what we'll do now is take questions, and we'll alternate between spoken questions and questions from the chat. I see there's only 2 comments in the chat so far. If anybody'd like to type in questions as we go, that'd be great. And then does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask Adam to start us off? I'm going to ask this one to prime the pump. I don't know if you saw or not, but the governor issued some grants to coastal communities today. Could you tell us about what those are? And if Titus is watching, if he wants to tune in also to supplement anything you have to say, Adam, that'd be great. What about those?
Yeah, so today I just saw that headline. The governor announced the annual grants that were awarded from the Wisconsin Coastal Management Grant Program. I think it was about $1.5 million. I forget the number of projects, but the Wisconsin Coastal Management Program is a state program within the Wisconsin Department of Administration. It's sort of a state-federal partnership with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to support local governments and local nonprofits to do coastal projects. So those projects range anywhere from improving public access, doing coastal education, helping reduce pollution to the Great Lakes, and planning. So that slate of projects kind of covers the gamut there. It's an annual grants program. Yeah, so they just got clearance from the feds to announce the award. So that's what they did. So a lot of good projects in there.
Very good. Bia, do you want to read the first question from the chat?
Yeah, the first question is, do the Great Lakes have tides, and what is their extent?
So yeah, that is a great question. I think typically we think of the Great Lakes as having no tides. We think of that as being the oceans, but they do have small tides. Every body of water does. It's just our bigger bodies of water are affected more by the moon. So across most of the Great Lakes, those tides are pretty small and wouldn't really be noticeable if you're out there. One place that they are the largest is the Bay of Green Bay. That was something that Professor Chin Wu at UW-Madison sort of had a student really look at the water level data there and look at the frequency of the fluctuations, and it matched really well with that daily tide cycle. So I think, I can't remember the magnitude off the top of my head, but I think in Green Bay it's a few inches. Definitely not as much as on our ocean coasts. And then once you get to more open coasts of the Great Lakes, Green Bay is a very long and shallow embayment that sort of amplifies those tides. Say off Milwaukee, you probably wouldn't really notice that the small tide.
So I'm looking at the NOAA website that asks, do the Great Lakes have tides? And what they say, it's the biggest ones are in the spring, and they average about 5 centimeters, which is just shy of 2 inches.
Yeah.
All right. Bia, do you want to read the next one from Larry?
Yeah. Are similar resources available for the Four Lakes region or along Lake Wisconsin or the Wisconsin River?
That's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, since my focus is mainly the Great Lakes coasts. I know in trying to put together some of those resources for Great Lakes coastal residents, Wisconsin DNR has, say, shoreline planting guides and things like that, which can guide you to healthy vegetation. So I'm not 100% sure, but I'm sure there's at least some information out there.
And you want to read Larry's question about the Mississippi and the barriers, Bia?
I do not have that question on mine, Tom.
All right, I will read it. Larry asks, as I've read regarding barriers along the Mississippi, for example, barriers are built to protect areas interest to the better off, which pushes the damage down to less wealthy areas. Is this happening in the Great Lakes regions?
Well, I guess, as I sort of mentioned when I was talking about the factors that influence erosion, certainly, say building a large stone structure on the shore to protect one property may have impacts on neighboring properties. It may or may not. It's sort of site dependent. So that can be a factor at increasing erosion to neighboring properties. And so there can be some issues if people act sort of in a piecemeal way, build one barrier here and increase erosion here, and then that person builds and sort of propagate the effect downstream. So I would say, yeah, there's spots where it is happening, and that's sort of folks just trying to protect their own property. So it is unfortunate.
I was always stunned by how much the water flows in Lake Michigan. I think of the water just coming up and being perpendicular to the shore, but apparently that's not the case, and you can sure see it on any windy day that it's hitting the shore obliquely, and it sets up a current, and it's more like a river flowing than I would have thought. It's not a flat little pond.
Yeah, and that flow is really important in moving sediment and sand around. There's definitely dominant directions where sediment flows along our shorelines.
Takes me back to paddle to the sea days. Almost everything I think I know about the Great Lakes I learned from paddle to the sea. Probably not everything in there is right, but I sure remember it. Speaking of Great Lakes and paddle to the sea, what did you think of the collapse of the video of the pictured rocks cliff falling in?
Yeah, I saw that yesterday. For those maybe who don't know, I think it was estimated to be like a 200-foot wide section up on the UP of rock. This sort of collapsed, and there's video footage from a pontoon boat. I think what I was thinking was, I'm glad I wasn't kayaking up next to the cliff. Definitely those rocky shorelines are a little bit more resistant to erosion, but the waves and water levels still work over time on them and can cause those sort of catastrophic collapses.
Do we have many YouTube videos of Great Lakes cliffs like that collapsing, or is this going to be a pretty valuable snippet of tape for the researchers to analyze?
I'm not aware of too many videos of Great Lakes bluffs sort of collapsing. I know there's some researchers. Mentioned Luke Zoot at UW
Yeah.
Madison, who's very intensively sort of monitored sites and put out cameras to capture those collapses. But I think, yeah, that's sort of it's a very episodic event. So any video footage is probably valuable to kind of know what's going on.
So about a month ago, Luke gave a talk on his research on glaciers. So it's great to hear you mention his work on the bluffs and erosion.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any other questions?
Tom, I have a question from YouTube.
Okay.
Somebody typed in the chat, could we engineer the bluffs to not collapse like this? Like maybe if we sculpted them or did some gradual grading to make the bluffs more resistant to collapse?
Yeah, so if you do have a pretty unstable bluff, one thing that can be done is to sort of cut it back to be a more stable slope that kind of is in its happy place for the soil that it's made out of. However, if the base of that bluff is still susceptible to wave erosion, that sort of work to stabilize it might become kind of undone if more wave action hits it and starts to take away that material again. So typically when someone will cut back a bluff to a more stable configuration, they'll also add shore protection to stop that. One thing that maybe the question also alluded to was if we change sort of the slope of the lake bed underneath the water to be more gradual or to break that wave energy before it reaches the shoreline, that's also one way to sort of protect a shoreline. That's done in breakwaters, or sometimes those breakwaters can be fully submerged under the water. But that's a lot more challenging when water levels fluctuate by 6 feet. So.
And then Bea, do you want to read the question from Sandy Shepard?
Yeah. Do you work with communities to develop guidelines for building along shores?
So yes. So there is, I think I sort of mentioned in that project with the city of Racine how they looked at their shoreline ordinances to see if they were sort of current with latest guidance. So the Association of State Floodplain Managers, which is a national organization but is based in Madison, Wisconsin, has put together a model ordinance for communities to perhaps adopt pieces of it to help limit the exposure of new development to hazards, as well as put in things like there, such as limiting vegetation removal. So folks don't clear cut their bluff and then inadvertently cause a problem. So that's definitely something when I work with communities to go through that self-assessment, that's definitely something we hit is sort of what sort of plans, what sort of ordinances do you have on the books, and is there areas where you can strengthen those so that long-term the actions that are taken in the city can be done in a way that increases its sort of resilience to these hazards.
And Bea, go ahead and read Jim Bauman's.
All right, this is a longer one, so if you can see it in the chat, that might help out too. But Jim says, during periods of low water, there was a lot of discussion on decreases in shipping due to harbors not having sufficient depth and recreational boaters not being able to get their boats out on the water. Much attention was focused on the corpse of engineers' past work on lowering the bed of the St. Clair River. Has anything come of the concern, or was it forgotten when the high water levels returned?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Definitely the water levels going from that prolonged low period and the record lows back to average and to be high alleviated some of those concerns, because that gave much more water depth for boats to get in and out. it always sort of when we hit either extreme, there's sort of a desire to change how water flows through the system. So when water levels were low, there was talk of, well, we've got to hold the water in Lake Michigan Huron. Don't dredge the river. Let's slow the flow of water. And now that water is high, we need to get water out of the system. And so it's sort of bouncing back with different concerns at those different extremes. But definitely dredging can be an ongoing issue for a lot of harbors because they get sediment coming in from rivers that flow into those harbors or getting pushed along the shoreline by waves. So I'd say the dredging concerns have been alleviated, but they don't go away, and they definitely need to be on folks' mind as water levels get lower as well. So.
And then Nancy said, I'm sorry, but I came in late. If you can answer quickly, why is Lake Michigan so high now? That'd be a good review question. So.
Yeah, so Lake Michigan is so high now, chiefly because we had a very, very wet period with record precipitation. 2015 to 2020 was the wettest 5 years in history for the upper Midwest. And so that was a predominant driver of why Lake Michigan and all the Great Lakes were so high.
When you were showing the water budget, you talked about water flowing out of the lakes through St. Lawrence and the sanitary canal in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't see anything about water leaking into the groundwater. Is there any estimate of how much Huron in Michigan or Great Lakes water in general leaks into, or actually how much water might come from groundwater into the lake? But I'm wondering, is this a big source of being able to recharge deep, very deep groundwater?
So that's a really good question. It's one that I've gotten a bit in the past, especially from geologists and hydrogeologists. And so I'm definitely not a groundwater person, but I tried to look into, has anyone estimated this? And when I looked at kind of a study that looked, the sort of review study that looked at individual studies of how much groundwater was going in and out through the Great Lakes, it sort of put it on the order of kind of like the Chicago River. I think if I recall correctly, it was like 6,000 or 8,000 cubic feet per second. And when I told that to a geologist, he said that seems really low. Like, I wonder if it's more than that. So I think partly it's a hard problem to study, and I don't know how much attention it's gotten, but I think the general consensus now is it's pretty small and compared to precipitation, runoff, and evaporation.
Okay. Well, I know one of the things about the geology and hydrology talks over the years, for me personally, if you would have asked me 15 years ago, I would have said it takes decades for rainwater to percolate down into the aquifers, say like Madison pulls the city water out of. And that's no longer the understanding that there's fissures and cracks and all kinds of stuff. And if there's fissures and cracks around here, why would there not be those under the lake beds, especially since the weight of the glaciers must have pushed that down and then they came back up. I'm assuming there's a lot of wrinkles and cracks on that. And that would be a very hard problem, but it'd be cool to get an idea of how much of that percolation is happening. One last one. You haven't talked much about wetlands. This is a lot about, understandably so, bluffs and cliffs and erosion on places where people put houses. They perch houses on high areas because it's gorgeous. What's the outlook for flat areas, for marshlands, for wetlands along the Great Lakes?
Sure. Yeah, that's definitely not my area of expertise, but definitely the water level, the high water levels has led to some wetland loss. I know particularly in Illinois, they kind of only have one sort of large wetland and naturalized area left, and it eroded pretty heavily in the last few years, over 100 feet. And so certainly the high water levels are a challenge for those wetlands. But also that natural variability can help with invasive species. Some can't survive. So, Phragmites took control big time when we had record low water levels, and I think there's been efforts to remove it, and then the high water levels I think have helped keep it at bay a little bit. Maybe I'm getting out over my skis because I'm not a biologist, but I know that the water level fluctuations to a point can be helpful to keep wetlands healthy, but when we hit these extremes, there's definitely been some wetland loss.
And do you want to read Jack's question?
Yeah, do fluctuations in water levels of Lake Mendota and Lake Monona at Madison follow a similar pattern?
That's a really good question. And I think I might have put a slide in here showing that. So it might be a little bit dated on Lake Mendota's water level fluctuations. But this is Lake Mendota from 2013 to 2021. So if you remember, I said, Lake Michigan was at a record low water level in 2013 and then kind of hit near record highs in 2020. You definitely don't see as extreme of an upward march in Lake Mendota, but definitely our record high precipitation years have kept Lake Mendota high in these years. And one thing that's, I would say, a big difference is I think we all remember the huge storm in 2018 and how that made Lake Mendota shoot up and water levels were high and really problematic the rest of the summer. The Great Lakes don't respond that quickly to a storm, in part because the scale of a individual thunderstorm is pretty small compared to, say, Lake Michigan. But Lake Mendota, the scale of that thunderstorm is pretty similar to Lake Mendota. So Lake Mendota can bounce a lot quicker in response to a storm. But definitely, those wet periods have caused high water levels in the Madison Lakes as well.
And then I'd like to ask one last one. It's about ownership, property ownership. And I'm assuming a private person can own property right up to some point in the lake shore. What happens to those ownership rights when the lake advances and erodes or recedes? How does that compare to like riparian river land ownership rights versus the Great Lakes?
Yeah, so at least on the Great Lakes, the property ownership goes to what is known as the ordinary high water mark, which is sort of, Wisconsin doesn't have a strict definition of that. Each Great Lakes state kind of has their own legal interpretation of what is an ordinary high water mark, but it's essentially the presence of where the water makes its presence known. So that could be like a line of destroyed vegetation, kind of where the waves kind of hit. And so as water levels go up, that can change the presence of where the water makes its presence known. And so that can kind of appear to change where ownership is. And it's a big problem, I would say, in the state of Michigan, because their ordinary high water mark is based on an elevation. And so they don't factor in kind of where the vegetation is. It just says, well, where the land intersects this elevation is where your ownership ends. So at low water levels, that pushes out where you can build. In some cases, there's a notable case like 200 feet. And then when water levels came up, that the shore receded and the elevation that they owned up to moved back quite a bit. So that house kind of built shore protection around it and was basically an island out into the lake. And that was partly because when the water levels went down, their land property went further out into the lake. So Wisconsin doesn't have as big of an issue with that because we don't have an elevation-based determination. It's more kind of the presence of vegetation. So
they have a little Mount St. Michigan out there in Michigan.
yeah, it is a very interesting thing to see a picture of it. It is.
Wow.
It's just sticking out there.
Such a French influence. I like it. Any others before we sign off? If not, thank you very much for coming in again tonight, Adam. It's been great to hear your talk and your insights. Thanks again, Bia, for technical support and reading the questions. And then we'll hope to see you next week, everybody, for the recycling plastics to reduce plastic pollution.